Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel. And today my guest is Seven Bremner. Hello, Seven.
Hi, Anna. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Well, this is a bit of an unusual conversation that we're going to have because most of my guests are practicing astrologers and we talk a lot about different aspects of the birth chart, etc. But you are here because you've written this amazingly beautiful and, well, informative book called Hermetic Philosophy and Creative Alchemy. And here it is. Um, and the reason I thought it would be lovely to talk to you on this channel is because there's an entire section to the book in which you are talking about the planets,
Mhm.
their mythology, and the hermetic links to it all.
Mhm.
So this is a wonderful in well, it's a wonderful way of gaining depth in understanding the planets that we work with as astrologers. So maybe for those who are unfamiliar with Hermeticism, it might be worth just beginning by giving like a little introduction, if it's possible, to what Hermeticism is, and then in the context of astrology, how it's linked or how astrology is linked with it, I think rather.
Okay, yes. Definitely difficult to sum it up in a simple way, but Hermeticism essentially is a spiritual, theological tradition that is grounded in the teachings of a figure named Hermes Trismegistus. And you could see Hermes Trismegistus as a mythical figure, as a sage that once walked the earth, as a god. There's many different ways that people have portrayed this figure. And there are certain texts that are attributed to Hermes. And these were written by, likely Greek and Egyptian, or Hellenistic philosophers living in Alexandria, the first few centuries of the Common Era, that were writing under the pseudonym of Hermes. And essentially, they had reached such a state of understanding of these teachings that they felt like they were communing with this divine figure. And so the main body of texts are known as the Corpus Hermeticum, or the Hermetica in a broader sense. But the Corpus Hermeticum is one of the texts that we work with in the Hermetic tradition. And there are 16 or 17, I can't remember at the moment, tracks within that book. And they all discuss things related to God and humanity's relationship to God and the cosmos and um, the mind of God and how that relates to our own mind and experience of reality. They discuss time and energy and metaphysical things. And astrology ended up being a big part of that. Um, Again, this was forming during the Hellenistic time period. So there were Egyptian astrological influences, Babylonian, Greek, all coming together. And so the Hermetic astrology could be considered very much the same as traditional astrology, traditional Western astrology. Um, yes. And so the seven traditional planets, which I write about in the book, those were the main planetary bodies that they knew of at the time that were visible to the naked eye and became understood in the Hermetic sense as demonic forces that sort of work upon the soul and conduct our fate.
I think it might be worth explaining demonic because some people might confuse that with demonic.
Yeah, so the word daemon in ancient Greece didn't have the same meaning as demon that we understand today. It was understood more as a sort of guardian spirit in a personal sense, But they also use the term daemon to refer to sort of the energetic messengers of the planets that enacted the will of the gods, for better or worse. So energies that would act upon the human soul in both positive and negative ways. So they had more of a neutral connotation. But then there's the concept of the daemon as well, which is like a guardian spirit that is born with you when you incarnate in life and sort of helps you stay on track and make sure that you're living according to the soul contract that you agreed to.
It's easy to think, listening to you, that there is a cohesive narrative of what God is. However, as you've pointed out, there are many different influences because this work is done over a very long period of time, and it encompasses different cultural experiences and different cultural views from different civilizations.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, to me, when I first read it, I thought that was fascinating because it's not one view of what God is, it's many views of what God is, and debates that we are having to this day about the nature of divinity and God. And so you've outlined beautifully there the link with astrology, and thinking about the mythology around the planets again. One of the questions that I'm so often asked by students is, you know, how did this come to be? How did, Saturn acquire this meaning? And of course, it's not one meaning and it's not one myth, it's many myths from different cultures. Mm-hmm. So I guess maybe it would be good to talk about that for a little bit, to see where the origins of the symbolism that we have for these planets comes from.
Yes, I talk about that quite a bit in the book, and I think a lot of it really goes back to the ancient Mesopotamian relationship with the planets and their observations. So like Saturn, they noticed was very slow moving and very dim, kind of like this dim, faint, like yellowish, tawny light, very slow moving, very far away seeming. And so I think that sort of began this understanding of Saturn as something that relates to slowness, to time, and to something kind of dark, And as that met with the Greek and Egyptian influences, I think, the Egyptian gods sort of got worked into that as well. And relationships to chaos or like the darkness that we experience in life all got wrapped up in the Saturnian complex. And similar with Jupiter as being like the brightest, or I guess Venus is the brightest, but one of the brightest stars in the sky. And sort of this really hopeful light, and so these associations with fortune and beneficence and goodness were observed early on in those Mesopotamian cultures. And yeah, same with Venus, its brightness and its beauty, and its cycles and its closeness to the sun. All of that was, part of what they observed and started to make their associations through. So I think it all kind of goes back to just simple observations of the human eye. And then as, they connected that with their gods and their mythologies, it all got woven together. And when other cultures came into contact with those ideas, they were able to relate them to their own gods. And that syncretic sort of spirit was very much a part of that age, the Hellenistic era.
There's such a cross-fertilization, isn't there, across civilizations, and even within the same time period, because of all the different, we think that we are the ones who travel a lot, because we've got planes, and we do travel a lot, but we forget that although the average person may not have done a lot of travel, there was a lot of travel and a lot of exchange through the trade routes, etc.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm actually diving a little more into that at the moment in my studies, really trying to understand how the South Asian influences came into that period and that area around the Mediterranean and northern Egypt, and how, the possibility of Buddhist teachings influencing Neoplatonic thought and how that also influenced the Hermetic tradition. So that's kind of what I've been looking at recently. And there were Buddhist monks living in Alexandria around the first century, from my understanding. More so like going a little further on, like third century, but as early as the first century, they were thought to have already been in the area. So there's, a good case for saying that there were also Buddhist influences or, influences of Indian thought um, upon these Hellenistic traditions like Hermeticism. That's fascinating to me.
It is because we would think that, or we have been led to believe that the only reason this influence exists is because of Alexander the Great's empire heading into Persia and being very close on the borders with India. So to hear that there were actually Buddhist monks in Alexandria is quite an eye opener. That one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, Plotinus, who, we have the Enneads from, was said to have been very enthralled by the Persian and Indian mystic traditions and was very inclined to learn more. And it was thought that it's possible that his teacher, Ammonius Saccas, had been trained in these traditions as well. Um, we don't know for sure, but yeah.
Yes, obviously nobody worried about cultural appropriation in those days.
Not so much. Not so much.
And thank goodness, because as a result of that, there is this incredibly rich um, source of thought and philosophy that is exchanged between different cultures as well. Is there any evidence of it going the other way, of sort of Hellenistic ideas, etc., ending up in the East?
Yes, and my understanding is that it was quite an influence on the arts, um, especially. Um, but that's still something I want to look more into. But yes, there was a dual exchange going on. Um, though my impression is that they weren't as impressed by the Greek philosophies.
No, I think I might understand that. um,
Yeah.
so coming back then to the Hermetic view that influences astrology, tell us more about that.
Yes. So in the Hermetic cosmology, um, these seven planetary spheres um, basically rule over human destiny and fate. They call it the harmony of the spheres. And the idea is that as long as a human being is sort of unaware of these influences, sleeping through life, uh, unconscious, as we would say today, these influences have full effect upon that human being, and can kind of direct them and guide them at their will. And that's fate. And in the Hermetic system, though, it's talked about as something that you do at the time of death, but the secret sort of doctrine is that it's something that you do all through your life. And it's a process of rising up or ascending through these planetary spheres that the human soul has had descended through in its incarnation and taken on these energies and this fated life, ascending through those once again and reaching a place where one is above the harmony. and then has greater agency over their own existence and is living in a sort of cosmic dance with the universe. And this is called the eighth sphere. So there's 7 planetary spheres, and through ascending those, one reaches the eighth sphere. And this is also called the creative sphere or the formative sphere. And basically, we return to our godlike nature where we are co-creating this existence rather than just kind of being, prodded along by these energies that are having their fun with us.
And that's very interesting because then you said um, there's an element of if we're unconscious of not being able to work with these energies, which implies that if we develop awareness, then that changes.
Yes. Yes. And I think it's so complicated the way that these energies affect us, you know? We get very polarized, and I like to, my approach is very syncretic. So I was trained in polarity therapy. I have an understanding of esoteric anatomy based on Indian teachings, Vedic teachings of the chakras. Um, so to me, like relating the planets to the chakras makes sense. The 7 traditional planets, the 7 chakras. And so we can experience how these planets are affecting us within our bodies, but also emotionally, mentally, and the sort of pattern that they are playing out, these mythical dramas. And through understanding both of astrology and the movements of the planets and transits that we might be going through and all of that, but also understanding their mythologies from different cultures and kind of getting a sense of like what their mission is, what they're trying to do through their energies and how they're um, affecting us, because that's how they continue living, it's through the human being. We embody those dramas of the gods. And yes, through becoming more aware of this, it's not so much like we're just being like puppets on a string, but we are then becoming godlike ourselves and changing the myths through our own existence or evolving the myth.
And in actual fact, that is not a million miles from the view that a psychological astrologer would take, whereby what we are doing is understanding the archetypes that are given to us in the mythology
Mm-hmm.
in order to gain the understanding we need to free ourselves from maybe maybe we need to make a distinction then between fate and destiny.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Mean is so that we are freeing ourselves from the shackles of, let's say, conditioning or psychological predispositions or ancestral trauma or so that
Mm-hmm.
we then have a truer sense of who we are. And maybe the difference would be that we're not waiting until we die to ascend through the 7 spheres, so that we can actually be free in this lifetime. So I think that that's very interesting to explore that again. So yes, let's talk about the difference between fate and destiny then.
Yeah, I still puzzle over this. It's so interesting, but I guess to me, when you have sort of transcended those energies of the planets, that's when you step into your destiny to become what you were meant to become. And I think ultimately the goal of human life is, we're all here to realize who and what we actually are. And that is our unified existence with the absolute reality. And I think that's really the message that we get from all of these different wisdom traditions from around the world. Um, and it's so hard to wrap our little human mind around. And it's much easier to kind of just fall into this place where we're being guided along by these energies. Um, but I think that's ultimately what we're looking at, is like stepping into our destiny as embodied godlike beings that exist in two worlds, both mortal and immortal.
Absolutely. And, I was just thinking that some time ago, when I first started looking into alchemy and Hermetic principles, um, my question was, can we transcend, or better put it better way, can we change the square transits to trine transits by,
Oh,
can there be this transmutation of one to the other through a better understanding of the energy that's there? And so I don't know what you feel, but the conclusion I have come to is that yes and no. So what I feel is that it's all about the perspective and the shifting of the perspective, and that the challenges that squares bring are the challenges that squares bring, but we can either allow ourselves to be defeated or feel as though we are at the mercy of fate,
mm-hmm.
or we can look at it I am by no means unaware of how challenging this is, particularly when it's Pluto or something that's squaring or opposing.
Yeah.
But we can look at it and go, right, so how do I rise above this?
Mm-hmm.
What is it that I'm meant to learn from this? And I think that when we do that, it shifts. It's a subtle nuance, but it's an important nuance from having a feeling of it being done to me to actually working with the energy
Mm-hmm.
for that growth. What do you feel?
Yeah, I haven't really thought much about the possibility of transmuting a square into a trine. I love that idea. But I think you're right that it's more about understanding and sort of accepting the challenge that's there, and maybe trying to see it from a higher perspective, because we don't know what's meant for us, and we don't know the outcome of a negative situation if it's a challenging situation that we find ourselves in because of this square transit that's happening. There may be some really beautiful thing that's going to come from that eventually, but we don't know that. Just like when we have good fortune and we have a beautiful trine and something wonderful happens, um, it could also lead to something unfortunate in the future. We just don't know. So to kind of take everything in stride and just to say, to accept it and surrender to both the good and the bad, I think is maybe a way of finding more grace with it, and also more agency, rather than like, yes, this is happening to me. And then ultimately, I think from a Hermetic perspective, the idea is that we're understanding that these influences, these planets, these gods, these are us. We are doing this. It's not being done to us. This is us, you know?
I was just thinking about how challenging this concept is for, us mere humans. Um, and I was smiling to myself because honestly, if I'm watching a suspenseful film that's getting a
Mm-hmm.
bit too intense, you can guess what I do. I fast forward through that bit slowly to take out the intensity of whatever the feelings are, because
Yeah.
it's too much for me. It's
Yeah.
overwhelming for me.
Yeah.
And I find it easier to go back and watch it at a normal speed once I know everything's going to be okay. And that, I think, is a great metaphor for how we feel. It would be so much easier to endure those challenges and the intensity of the emotion that comes with them if we only just knew it was going to be okay in the end.
Yes. Yes.
Because it's that fear, isn't it? Because we don't know. We're being pushed into a road that we're not familiar with, and which is very frightening or very uncomfortable, and we don't know why. And that's where working with the energies, I think, helps us, because
Yeah.
we can perhaps get an understanding of how we got here. How did I get here? How did this happen? And then perhaps be able to work out a more positive way of dealing with it.
Yeah. And that's also where I really love alchemy and the alchemical approach, because in the great work of alchemy, there's traditionally 4 stages. Sometimes people talk about 3 stages, but in the 4 stages, which is what I work with, the first one is the nigredo and the blackening. And it's the same if you're working with 3 stages. It's still the blackening is the beginning of the work. And there's a saying in alchemical axiom, when you see your matter going black, you know that the work has begun. And so when we find ourselves in these really difficult times, from an alchemical perspective, that's that's the beginning, you know. And even though it might be really hard, still doesn't make it easier. It gives you this perspective of continual transformation. And when you're in those darkest moments, that's where the greatest transformation is taking place. And it's our resistance to it that makes it so hard.
And that takes us back to Saturn then,
Yeah.
because that is the process that's associated with Saturn. So tell us more then about Saturn from this perspective. Um, if I remember correctly, it is Saturn that's associated with the last sphere, or the one that we come in through first. So
Mm-hmm.
tell us about that.
Yeah. So the in the descent of the soul through the spheres begins with Saturn, which is the furthest away, and then it moves to Jupiter, Mars, and then the Sun is sort of in the middle, and then Venus, Mercury, and the Moon being the closest to the Earth. And everything below the Moon is the sublunary realm where we exist. Um, and it's interesting that, and it doesn't fit perfectly together. That we begin with Saturn as we descend, and then we kind of ascend, beginning with the Moon as we're rising through the spheres, versus the alchemical process, which begins with the Saturnian nigredo. The Saturn is sort of like heralding the beginning of this alchemical work and transmuting the darkness within us into something divine, sublime, and immensely powerful within the soul. So it doesn't fit perfectly together, but nonetheless, we begin with Saturn as we're descending. So we begin with Saturn as we're sort of like returning to our unified essence. And that's kind of how I see the ultimate conclusion of the great work of alchemy, is to find that sense of oneness within the self and the reconciliation of opposites.
I think actually, listening to you, it's not something that I've thought about before, but it's occurred to me that there is a purification, an intention of purification that we can see with Saturn. Because
Mm-hmm.
if he's the first of the 7 spheres, which means closest to divinity, if we like, then as we're coming in, maybe it's useful to think, okay, this is your mission. You're coming into the world, this is your mission. And then coming out again is the purification. But when we're talking about that alchemical process, those are the moments in time when I guess Saturn knocks on our door and there's a kind of reckoning that goes, okay, yeah, you remember that mission that you're on? You've forgotten. So time to get to work.
Yes, I love that analogy. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, there's Saturn comes knocking because there's something that we need to rectify within the self. And that's that great other Hermetic or axiom, which is the Latin is visita interiora terra, rectificando invenius occultum lapidum. And that means journey into the earth, journey within, rectify what you find, and you will find the hidden stone. So through this process of purification, going within, rectifying these traumas, these wounds, these fears, negative storylines that we have, beliefs, all of these things, these conditionings that we have within us, um, we rectify them, we bring them to balance, we set them right. And through that process, we find this hidden stone, which is the philosopher's stone, which is that indestructible, everlasting, immutable, eternal awareness that's always there. It just gets kind of clouded over. It's not something we have to create. It's not something we have to search for all over the earth. It's always right there. And it's just a matter of kind of like clearing away the corrupted things that have like grown over it through our existence.
So the question is, given that we've got Saturn closest to divinity, and that really he's about the impetus to refine and purify, how is it that he becomes associated with something evil and Satan? How does that happen?
That's a great question. Well, in a traditional astrological sense, that's where we get these terms malefic, right, and benefic for the planets. So Mars and Saturn being the greater and lesser benefic, or sorry, greater and lesser malefic planets. And again, I think the coldness, the dryness, the distance, the slowness, all of these things contribute to that malefic influence. And with Mars being fiery, hot and dry, sort of like passionate and burning and red, like just kind of basic associations with these planetary lights that have these qualities. I think that's where the root of it is. But then how it becomes associated with Satan, that's an interesting, and I know I write about it and it's kind of like escaping me at the moment, but yeah, I know it's in my chapter on Saturn and I don't remember exactly how it all fits together, but
no, I know it's been a little while since I read that bit too, but it's something that is generally known. I mean, Liz Green wrote a book, about Saturn called A New Look at an Old Devil. So
yeah,
there is that association. And my gut feeling here is that it's because basically we don't enjoy the Saturn experience. And therefore, because we don't enjoy it and we know it brings pain, we begin to associate it with something malefic. And yeah, it's not much fun. I've had Saturn square after Saturn square for about 2 years now, as it's doing its rounds through my chart. And it's not a picnic. It really isn't. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that it's not been important. And what always comes through these experiences is exactly that, the refinement, the purification. So I'm not going to badmouth Saturn, not because I'm afraid that he's going to punish me, but because to do so would be to devalue the importance of the process of growth that I've been going through. So I think
Yeah.
that that's quite an important thing. And I do feel that it's our tendency to understandably wants to avoid pain that gives Saturn this bad reputation, shall we say.
Well, yeah, Saturn is associated with all of the challenging things: death, time, decay, old age, senescence, um, putrefaction, slowness, inertia, all of these things, limitations, restrictions, like, but at the same time, yeah, that power of transformation, but also discipline and dedication and loyalty and all of the blessings that Saturn brings us as well. Um, so, and really, all of the planets have positive and negative influences. Even though Saturn is the greater malefic, Venus has a malefic side. She's got a dark side. Mercury is, you know, can tend to be very amoral and go both ways. All of them have negative expressions. And it's just that Saturn happens to be the most difficult one. But
Yeah.
yeah, and because of that, I think, yeah, we want to associate it with evil, with darkness, and it is dark, dark and cold. But from our human perspective, we don't understand the purpose of those time periods in our lives. There's a greater purpose unfolding. And I think that's where that association with evil comes from. It's just that we don't understand the full scope of what needs to happen.
And we can't fast forward to check the end either. So if we've got Saturn as the closest to the divine, the moon is closest to us. So just briefly, tell us about that.
I think the moon is because of its proximity, it has such a powerful influence on us. And we feel it so physically. And even the scientific community will agree, like, the moon is affecting the tides, it's affecting the water and the fluids in our body, whereas they'll be skeptical about the influences of the other planets in a physical way. But yeah, the moon is so close to us, and it's our closest connection to the cosmos. So if we're beginning a magical practice, it makes sense to kind of begin with the moon, right? And just follow the cycles of the moon and get in tune with the waxing and the waning and the darkness of the moon and the brightness of the moon and all of these different phases, as a way of understanding what's going on within us. And because the moon relates to the body and to the emotions, it's pretty easy to kind of tune into that. So I think that's the first thing that comes to mind when you ask me about the moon. It's just that it's our direct connection to our cosmic self.
I like that because it's true. It is the closest thing that we've got, in the cosmos. And I like the link that you made with ritual and magic. That it's like a portal into the rest of existence, if we can put it like that. So I like that very much. It's wonderful. And actually, if we're looking at ourselves and understanding ourselves, as a therapist, I spend my life helping people connect to their feelings where they become disconnected, and
Yeah.
ground, helping them to ground that into their bodies. Excuse me, so that they have a better understanding of themselves. It does exactly begin with the moon. So it makes complete sense. Well, Seven, I am so grateful to you for having another wonderful conversation. I'll be putting a link to the book in the description box, of course, and a reminder to everyone that it is Hermetic philosophy and creative alchemy. And I believe it should be read by astrologers everywhere, just to give us more of a context for what the symbols that we're using every day when we're looking at charts. But along with that link, I will also be putting a link to other interviews I've done with Seven on my other channel, In the Light Growing Your Soul. Seven, if people want to find out more about your work, and you are an amazing artist as well, how do people find you?
Well, I have a website, and that's a great place to go first. And that's just Marlene7Bremner.com. And maybe you can have a link to that also. And I am on Instagram. My handle is at M7, the number, artist, M7 artist. And I also have a Patreon, so people can subscribe and get more content, support the work that I'm doing. And that is just at patreon.com/7arts. And yeah, I'm offering Hermetic alchemical coaching as well now. So people can work with me one-on-one to get mentorship in their creative, alchemical, Hermetic practices. I try to meet people where they're at with that. And it's been really wonderful doing that. Yeah, lots of ways to connect with me and to find me. So
Fantastic. I will be sure to have them in the description box. Thank you once again for your time today.
you're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me on the show, Anna. It's been a pleasure, truly.
And thank you all for watching. Next time, we're going to be looking at some unusual astrologers. Until then, goodbye.